So, what can you tell us? What are we getting here? Let me ask you this: when a defensive assistant takes a job, do you assume that he's basically going to run the system that he comes from? Like, how much Fangio are we getting here, you think?
Yeah, I think it depends on the guy, obviously. Like, depends on what stops they had before. There are, some defense assistants that had coached under multiple different defensive coordinators that play multiple different schemes. But when you have a guy like Christian Parker, who's really majored in the Vic Fangio schemes for most of, I think, the last half decade outside of 1 year with Vance Joseph. So my understanding is it's going to be like very Vic Fangio adjacent. Obviously, he's going to have his own little spin on things just from his personal preferences, and maybe some of his stops along the way will change a little bit, but I'm guessing it's going to be very similar to what Fangio and the Fangio adjacent teams have been in the NFL.
Hey, John, you're so smart talking about these things, so I'm going to ask you this question, and seriously, I'm trying to learn here. Does Dallas have the personnel to run the style of scheme he wants to run?
I think so, because a big thing that you hear a lot of the Fangio people say, and especially Christian Parker in a lot of his interviews, is they don't really have a type of player. They like to really, their scheme is very malleable around the skill sets of the players they have at hand. They can play, like, say they have a nickel who's really much more accustomed to playing man than playing zone. They can play more man techniques, more man match, more zone match schemes. If you have guys that are a little bit better playing zone, playing off, they have little adjustments in their schemes to do that. So I think, they have the players, they have players to be able to do it. You just want to get higher caliber players so that it can be run at a higher level, obviously. But I think the bare bones of the defense is there, that you can do a lot of the things, especially up front. I think the five-man fronts, the kind of, people say 3-4, but it's more of like a five-man surface on the line of scrimmage. I think that's going to really fit the Cowboys' personnel they have right away with Kenny Clark, Oso Digizua, and Quinnen Williams. The ability to get all three of those guys on the field at the same time and manufacture one-on-one matchups, I think, is going to allow them to have a lot of success in that department. So
I was going to ask you about that is, as far as, like, do any of these players that we're working on in the draft now, like, okay, Falk from Auburn, a 6'6", 285, is that something that maybe in the old scheme kind of out of place, but now in this scheme more likely back in place?
I do think he's a better fit in the Fangio Christian Parker scheme, because when they're playing up front, they play with a lot of light boxes. And when you play with a lot of light boxes, you have to find a way to steal gaps. And the way that the Fangio, adjacent, the way that Christian Parker and those guys have typically done it is they play a lot of gap and a half techniques. And that sounds like really crazy, really wild. Like, I've heard single gap, I heard two gap. What's the difference? It's kind of like they play single gap, but they're not, instead of attacking upfield through their gap, they're attacking into their gap, holding their position, and then once the ball carrier declares where he's going to go, then you'll see them shed and go to an adjacent gap. So that's a way that they can make the run fit sure despite having a lighter box. So I think a guy like Falk, who's a big, strong guy, really good against the run, has the ability to play with extension, peek in one side, play in one primary gap, and then shed and go to another because he's so long and he knows how to utilize his length really well. I think that, especially in the run game department, he's someone who fits really well into what Parker and the Fangio type of guys like to do.
So what you know about the linebackers in the draft then? Okay, like the Allens, Georgia, Hill at Texas. Is there somebody in particular that we're not thinking about now that we need to think about with those inside linebackers? Or was that always going to be, an area no matter what you were going to have to look at?
I think that was going to be an area no matter what that you had to look at, just because the Cowboys' personnel and talent in that department was so subpar last year.
Right.
Now, one thing that that Fangio has done in the past, he will run a lot of what's called penny fronts, and that only has it has five quote-unquote defensive linemen, but it's really like 3 interior defenders and 2 edge defenders, and only 1 linebacker on the field. So if you're really have subpar talent at the linebacker position. These type of fronts are a way to kind of limit their exposure, but still getting other people on the field. That's why in this scheme, the nickel is so important, because he's going to have a lot of run-fit responsibilities in this scheme. And if you have a nickel that can not only play the pass well, but he can also fit against the run, think of what someone like Nick Emmanwori has been doing with the Seattle Seahawks.
Mm-hmm.
Mike McDonald's talked a lot about that they're playing basically a 4-3, just a 4-3 under in their nickel personnel, because Nick Emmanwori, I'm saying his name all messed up, but you guys know what I'm talking about.
Emmanwori, yep.
Yeah, we know who you're talking. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
His ability to fit against the run allows them to play a lot of base package schemes, even though they're in their nickel personnel. And I think that's very similar to what you'll see Christian Parker type of do if they don't have the talent at the linebacker position going into this year.
John Owning with us here in the G-Bag Nation. I love the focus, too, when it comes to, the nickel and the slot corner. Because I think, John, you're seeing teams move their best receiver into the slot. We had that conversation with Deron Bland at camp. And Bland he was looking for the contract. He wanted to stay on the outside. I think you've always been able to make a case that maybe the big money corner should be the slot corner. So when you look at the Cowboys' current personnel and how Christian Parker might want to utilize that position, do they have anybody in-house that you think can do that, or are you looking at anybody in free agency or through the draft that maybe they'd have their eye on?
I definitely think that, and it's funny, Ted Nguyen at The Athletic just wrote a big old write-up about the nickel position, the slot cornerback position, and how it's becoming much more valuable in today's NFL. And he actually had a lot of really good quotes from the Eagles safety coach, who was kind of Christian Parker's right-hand man as the full defensive backs coach and passing game coordinator. And he was talking about how, historically teams value the outside cornerbacks as the most important, the most vital person in that defensive backfield. But he was making the argument, and from what Ted says, it seems like Christian Parker really co-signs this idea that the slot is actually the most valuable person in the secondary, because obviously I said about the run fits, but also teams are throwing to the middle of the field so much because it's the nearest way, the ball has to travel the least amount of distance to get there, and that's where the slot's going to be one of the closest defenders and how important it is. I think Deron Bland can do it. I think he does a lot of good things in the inserting against the run. I think he has the ability to play zone and man from the nickel from the slot. But I think a lot of it is going to determine about, just like in the draft, who is on the board. I think you can find a lot of these good slot corners that can kind of do a little bit of both in like the day 2 area, maybe depending on what the Cowboys trade back or whatever. I think it's very, very important to see, because Deron Bland can go both outside and inside. So I think it's just going to depend on who's available. Is it easier to find the outside guy, or is it easier to find a slot guy, and then kind of Bland will take whoever will take the spot that they don't get the influx of talent?
John, in terms of Eagles defenders that could maybe come over in free agency, you have like Jalen Phillips on the edge, you have Nakobe Dean at linebacker, Reed Blankenship at safety. Does any one of those guys pique your interest to bring over here with Parker? I mean,
Jalen Phillips, I think he's one of the better edge rushers in the NFL. The big question with him is just health, and he has a really, really messy history. I mean, he medically retired in college already, and he's been hampered by injuries throughout his NFL career. But if you can get him for a decent contract, he's definitely someone who I would bring in to bring that influx of edge rush ability and the ability to be able to drop occasionally, because that's something that I know a lot of fans aren't talking about. But those Fangio schemes, they run sim pressures at like a 35% rate. And when you combine that with the blitz, they're bringing extra defenders from the second level on almost 50% of their snaps against the pass. So you're going to need to have, edge defenders that can drop into coverage, that can play a hooked zone, that can play the flats, and they're not going to be a total mismatch there. Now, obviously, you're not going to have them running with receivers or running with tight ends down the field, but if they can do these really simplistic zone drops, and Jalen Phillips has proven throughout his career that he is competent in that area, I think he's someone who could be a very valuable piece to a potential Cowboys defense if they were to make themselves. And I also think Nakobe Dean is a decent option just because he would help install the scheme. He's not I don't think he's the best linebacker. I think he has some issues getting off blocks and stuff. But when you play with 5-man surfaces and you're doing a lot of the gap in the half stuff, it does take a little bit of the pressure off of the linebackers in their run fits and having to deal with linemen getting in their face immediately. So I think that he would be a pretty good fit to put in next to DeMarvion Overshown if that's the direction that you want to go, rather so that you have a little bit, so that you can focus on maybe other positions in the draft.
It's John Owning, PFF, with you here on your home of the Cowboys. John, if it doesn't go right for Christian Parker, is there anything you can anticipate? Like how much is having to call plays possibly throwing a wrench into the momentum of a coach?
Yeah, I think there's two things that can really mess up his stint as the Cowboys defensive coordinator. One is, like you said, calling plays. He's never done that before. That was a big reason why I had Jim Leonard a little bit ahead of him, is that even though we hadn't called plays in the NFL, he did call plays in college at Wisconsin. To my knowledge, I don't think Christian Parker's ever had to call plays. Now, I think it's something he's going to be able to do just because he's been such a big part of the game planning process, and he's so familiar with the different types of offensive schemes, especially like the Shanahan system. He's been, in his stops, he's kind of been the guy who's taken the task of learning the Shanahan scheme and finding ways to attack and dictate to them so that you can have a better shot in the defense. And I think that's a big reason why Fangio's teams have been one of the more successful schemes against the Shanahan tree. And then the other one is going to be just talent evaluation at positions outside of the defensive backfield. I think he's already proven his ability to scout and evaluate defensive backs. We saw what he did with Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean with the Eagles. Mm-hmm. But does he have that same eye for linebackers? Does he have that same eye for defensive tackles, edge defenders, those type of things? If you don't get those right, it can make your ability to install this scheme a lot harder, because even though I really like this scheme and there's a lot of good things that you can do, and I think it's going to raise the floor of the defense as a whole, we saw in the past with a guy like Brandon Staley, who runs very similar Fangio schemes, that when you don't have the talent to run, you don't have good enough talent to run the scheme, it's still going to be it could turn out to be a subpar unit as a whole. So I think those are the two main things: calling plays and evaluating talent outside of the defensive backfield.
Well, and last year it was all with the zone stuff, and not everybody was on the right page. So what can you tell us about some of the coverage elements that maybe he'll try and deploy here?
Oh, yeah. I was hoping you were going to ask me this.
Of course.
This has been one of the things I've been diving most into since he's been hired. And the main tenet of the defense is they are very simplistic pre-snap. So they're showing you the same, like, two high safety shells on almost every play. And then post-snap, that's when they're rotating to their single high, to their cover one stuff, or to their weak rotated cover three stuff. And the thing that's interesting about weak rotated cover three is it allows you to be a little bit more balanced with your skilled coverage defenders, because everything that they dictate, strong and weak, that nickel is always going to be to the passing strength. So if you, in a typical regular cover three, and you're bringing also the strong safety down to play on the passing strength as well as the nickel, it can make you a little bit more susceptible on the weak side, to the non-passing strength side, because you're having two linebackers over there that can get taken advantage of. And that's something that we see a lot of the Shanahan scheme, while they have been so successful against those defensive coordinators that match up in those typical cover three like Eberflus plays, is because you can isolate those linebackers on the backside and have a lot of success. But when you bring the safety down to the non-passing strength, then you have a little bit more of an equalized coverage strength to both sides, because you have safeties and corners on both sides, or safety and corner on one side, nickel and corner, and those guys are going to be better in coverage than just your typical off-ball linebacker. So I really like that. And then another thing that he employs a ton of is split field coverages, playing quarters on one side, playing halves on the other, or cover two on the other. And what that allows you to do is allows you, by game plan, to really isolate and take away the opposing team's number one receiver. One big thing that we see in the NFL nowadays is teams are running a lot of 3-by-1 formations, three receivers to one side, isolate your number one receiver to the backside. And what the Eagles, or what Fangio and Christian Parker and those guys like to do, is they'll play cover 2 to the side where the number 1 receiver is to the isolated receiver side, and that allows you to create a pseudo bracket where you're having your cornerback press the wide receiver at the line of scrimmage, disrupt the timing of his route, and then you have the safety over the top bracketing him, so you have kind of an under-over vice on that receiver, a 2-over-1. So that allows you to, be really take him out of the game plan and force the quarterback to look elsewhere. But the good thing is because you're playing quarters to the side with 3 receivers, you're getting a 4-over-3. So that's a big thing in the Fangio schemes, is you're going to always have a +1 in the coverage department. So they're throwing numbers at it. You're not going to get many 3-over-3s or 2-over-2s where, the offense is going to have the success because they know what they're doing. You're going to have more numbers, so that gives you a better shot to defend those different route concepts on a given play.
You're crushing it, John. Love it. Want to talk more to you about it, but we got 2 minutes till your time. So smoke up, Johnny.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thanks,
you guys.
buddy.